on the exercise itself, it gave you, I think, 3 or 4 choices, potential answers. So we will go through and see what you answered, and I'll do it by show of hands. And first I'll get a copy of the exercise myself. Okay, do you like this little story of the robbery? All right, so I will go through. We have 12 questions, and I will ask you how many think it's true, how many think it's false, maybe, etc. Those 4 choices at the top. So, a man appeared after the owner had turned off his store lights. How many think it's true? Just show of hands. How many think it's false? How many think it's maybe? And how many think... Oh, that's the third. So there's 3 choices. All right, so we have about a third each way. A third true, a third false, and a third maybe. So who was one of the people that answered true? Why do you think it's true?
Because he had just turned off the lights when a man appeared. So a man appeared when he turned off the lights. It was like a sequential to me.
Okay. A man appeared, so you've just read the first sentence and said that's what it means. Who said false? All right, why did you say false?
It says a businessman had turned off the lights, and the question is, a man appeared after the owner had turned off the store lights. The story says a businessman turned off the lights.
And so does that mean it couldn't be the owner?
Okay, I've changed it.
Okay. So how many answered duh? And why did you answer duh?
Because it just says that the businessman had just turned off the lights, and so when a man appeared, you really don't know if that businessman was the owner or not.
Yes, exactly. That's the correct answer. You look at the words and where the words are placed and the inferences they make. But if you look at actually what does it say, you cannot categorically tell from what is in that couple little sentences whether the owner had turned off his store lights. Okay, let's go to number 2. You're getting a sense of what this is about. The robber was a man. How many think true? How many think false? No one thinks false? How many thinks don't know? All right. And about a third of you aren't answering now. You're already getting skitsy. So who answered true? Why did you answer true?
Because the instructions said to assume that the information present in the story was definitely accurate, and the story says a man appeared.
Okay. So the robber was a man, definitely? Okay.
The owner could have been a woman, and they could have been robbed.
Okay, you're saying the robber might have been, since the owner might have been a woman, the robber might have been a woman. Okay, who answered don't know?
I answered true. I'm sorry.
You said true?
Because he
Okay.
demanded money.
Okay.
I actually don't know because you don't know that person is a robber. He just demanded money. He could have demanded money for bad service or some other reason.
Anybody else have any take on this?
It just says the contents of the cash register were scooped up. It doesn't say by whom. And then a man ran away. It didn't say that the man that ran away was the man that scooped up.
All right, so what is the focus of that point?
I was going to say the person demanding the money could have been the owner.
Person demanding the money could have been the owner. Okay. Anybody else have any comment on that second item? Yes.
I've defined that there is no robbery in process.
Well, you want to say that again?
There's no robbery in process. No
What?
reference is made to a robbery.
What in those 3 or 4 sentences tells you that there was a robbery?
The police force was notified. It just says the story.
We're going to buy tickets to the Policeman's Auxiliary Fund campaign. We want you to come on down and sell us some tickets. What led you to believe there was an actual robbery?
No, the top title was leading on. The top.
The title itself
Right.
is leading you to believe that categorically a robbery has occurred. But when you read the sentences here, does anything in those sentences absolutely and positively tell you there was a robbery? There are inferences, or you might say, well, maybe it might have been and maybe it might not have been, but you do not have a categorical statement that there was a robbery. All right, let's continue on. The man who appeared did not demand money. How many think it's true? At this point, how many are afraid to answer anything? And usually by about the third answer, that's what you get. So no one thinks it's true. How many think it's false? And how many thinks you don't know? Or there's not enough information to tell one way or another? So the only ones willing to raise their hand were false. And that was because, who wants to answer? Anybody?
That's what it was said.
The man who appeared did demand money. You don't know who the man was, but there was a man who demanded money. All right, 4, the man who opened the cash register was the owner. How many think it's true? And you know I'm looking at you. How many think it's false? How many think not enough information? And because the owner could be a woman. The owner opened the cash register. You had a man who came in when a man appeared, etc., but there's nothing that says the owner was a man or a woman. So the correct answer is not enough information. The store owner scooped the contents of the cash register. How many think it's true? False. Not enough information. Right, you're getting onto it at this point. Someone opened a cash register. How many think it's true? Anybody think it's other than true? Because somebody opened it, no question about that. After the man who demanded the money scooped up the contents of the register, he ran away. How many think it's true? False. Not enough information. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't say who scooped up the contents of the register. Maybe somebody, maybe the man saw somebody scoop it up and ran away, so you don't know. While the register contained money, the story does not state how much. How many think that's true? How many think it's false? You think it tells you how much money there was? Pardon me?
It says the content.
Okay. Well, then would the answer be that it's false, or would it be not enough information? Because you're right, it doesn't tell you what was in the cash register. It might have been money, might not have been money. The robber opened the cash register. How many think it's true? False. How many think you don't have enough information? Why do you think you don't have enough information?
Again, took the position there was no robbery in progress.
All right, so is that not enough information, or is that a false?
Right. Well, I said not enough information, but it could have been false also.
All right, those of you who said false? The owner. So unless you think the owner is robbing himself, which has happened, I guess, at times, and reported to the police and the insurance company, the owner is the one who opened the register. 10, after the store lights were turned off, a man appeared. How many think it's true? False? Not enough information? And that's true. The robber did not take the money with him. How many think it's true? False. Not enough information. You're catching on. And finally, the robber did not demand the money of the owner. How many think that's true? False? Not enough information. All right, what's the point to this little exercise?
You need to clarify information.
Need to clarify. So let's turn this to a procurement arena. How does this relate to procurement, this wonderful topic we're dealing with? Why did we go through this? What does it do relative to this class and what we do for, I guess, a living? Yes?
It's important that we write very clear, precise specifications as well as we can, so there's no confusion about what it is we need.
It's important that we write clear specifications. And what's the corollary to that, if I can ask that question? What's the opposite side of that statement? Yes?
If you make inferences, people will assume. If you make inferences, people will assume.
If you don't write clearly and absolutely, other people who are reading it might make inferences that you perhaps did not intend. Yes?
Sometimes if they're unclear, the vendors would plan for the worst-case scenario and possibly raise their price in accordance with that.
All right, did you hear what he said? If it's not clear, you want to repeat that again?
If it's not clear, the vendor community will often assume the worst-case scenario and price accordingly, give the state a higher price.
So, based upon what all of you have said now, if you don't make it clear, somebody who's reading that, and that somebody will be a vendor, is going to make inferences, and those inferences may be correct or may not be correct. And so based upon how they interpret your wording, they may price themselves higher than they otherwise would because they think they have to do something that you really didn't mean for them to do. Or they might price it lower because they didn't understand that you wanted them to do something that they didn't understand they were supposed to do. It might have made a difference in who would have won the contract based upon those two situations. It may be a situation of a vendor wins, and after they start performing, then you ask them to do something, and they say, well, that's not what I interpreted I'm supposed to do. So you have this issue of ambiguity, and it all comes down to how you wrote it and how they interpreted it. So obviously, you will try your best effort to write as clearly as possible. And what are the other steps that can be done to hopefully get to the vendor's interpretation of what you wrote? Cure letters. That's when you're talking about competitive sealed proposals where you ask a vendor to give additional information, additional clarification, etc. What's something else? I know your favorite one from the last time we did this, and that would be the... What's the forum?
The supplements?
No, the forum, the primary forum for pre-bid conference, pre-bid, pre-proposal conference, where you should affirmatively go over your specifications. And if you took the Procure class, you might remember I said you should not conduct a passive pre-bid, pre-proposal conference, i.e. sit there and say, anybody have any questions? With the implication that if you do, there's something wrong with you, because these are the greatest set of specifications ever written, and no one can possibly have any doubt of the clarity of my specifications. So if you're stupid enough to ask a question, then I might answer it, but you really don't want to answer a question, because if you don't understand it, then you're the one that's a problem because you didn't understand it. So based upon that presentation or that type of demeanor, how many vendors are going to ask questions? And that's the issue. What you want is clarity. What you want is understanding. That makes everybody better. So you should emphasize vendors to ask questions, whether they be at the pre-proposal conference, whether they be before or after the pre-proposal conference. If you are doing an evaluated procurement, you want to have what I call meaningful discussions, so you get these issues on the table. You get the vendor to start talking so you can find out whether they understand what you thought you wrote. because if they don't, it's going to be problems all the way up and down the line. Okay, nice little exercise, right? Now we go back to the other stuff.
I think this is where we left off. I don't know if the clicker's working. If not, I'll change it.
Is the clicker working?
I've asked IT to come up and
Clicker does not appear to be working. All right, now hopefully we will start speeding up, even though we probably will not get through 500 slides in 2 days. We'll just see what we do. Okay, I'm going over simple rules. These are the ways to help make things clear. These help you to have clarity. Avoid redundancy. And there was this little saying in blue there that I heard one time about 9 years ago, and as soon as I heard it, I liked it. I didn't make it up. If you look at the bottom, I heard this from Lucy Slate, who was the head of procurement at Towson University, although at that time she was head of procurement for Harford County government. And she was teaching one of our classes back in 2002, I guess it was, and I was sitting in back of the room listening because I wanted to hear Lucy speak. And she said this, and as soon as she said it again, it resonated with me, and I said, I'm going to use that. And I have used that many, many times since then. And I do attribute it to Lucy. I don't know if she is the original originator of this. She's just the first one I ever heard say it. Say it once, say it well, don't say it again. And if you just think about that, if you say something, one of the problems that I have with specifications frequently in reading what people have written is to really emphasize something, they will say it once, and then twice, and then 3 times, and maybe 4 times, which is bad enough just the fact that it's repeated. But the thing that's even worse is many times, each time they say it, they don't say it exactly the same way. So that there are times when it's hard to interpret that it is the same thing simply being repeated. And depending, depending on how different those versions are, then you have the issue from the standpoint of the vendor, which version does the state mean? If they all say the same thing, that isn't as bad, but if there are slight variations and those variations have different meanings or different requirements, then which one is the requirement? Obviously, if you say it one time and you say it well so that it says what you mean, then that's the only thing they have to go on. What you said, and supposedly what you said is what you mean, and there's no confusion by having different variations repeated elsewhere. So that's one of the golden rules. Number 2, avoid excessive use of generic language, terms, clauses that don't apply to a given procurement. I have seen solicitations from certain agencies that have a standard list of about 50 different terms that they have definitions for. Any given procurement might only have 20 or 25 of those that apply. But the vendor has the duty, if you will, of going through there and trying to figure out which of all those terms apply to the particular procurement he or she is responding to and which don't. And it just creates confusion because they may make the wrong interpretation. They may assume something doesn't apply when it does. They may assume something does apply when it doesn't, and they may price higher or lower because of it. And it's just needless words that do more confusing than explaining. And again, we're trying to get to simplicity, say it well, say what you mean what you say, those type of things. Use direct, straightforward language. Tell vendors and contractors what they must do. Tell them what they must do. Don't tell them, and this is something I see all the time, they should agree to do something. I have a little something with an agency where I'm going to tonight continue writing my critique of their specifications, and I've already told them that there's one sentence, and I think it goes something like, it is not anticipated that the vendor will have employees work more than 8 hours. What does that say? It is not anticipated the vendor will have its employees work more than 8 hours. Does it say anything? It doesn't say you can, it doesn't say you can't. It just says that, I guess normally you shouldn't. But if normally you shouldn't, that means there theoretically are some times when you could. So what does it mean? And I already communicated to this agency and said that particular sentence, and I may not have quoted exactly, says nothing, that they should rewrite it to say something. They sent it back to me and said, we want to keep that sentence. And I'm going to write back to them, that's nice, but you can't. Either make it say something or get rid of it. Because that's the whole issue. You need to have your words have meaning. And what you have to do is translate what's in your mind to the words on paper, so that people don't have to try to do the mind meld and try to figure out what's in your mind. They can read what the words you wrote and get the meaning from that, hopefully. So, and all the time I see the vendor shall agree to, the vendor shall agree to. Well, that's nice, but what are they supposed to do other than agree to do something? Because that's the essence, not that they agree to do it, it's that they will do it. Seems simple to me. The goal is to use simple, direct words that are meant to inform, not to use convoluted language that is intended to impress but only confuses. And I can remember being in this room about 1980, 1981. The first time I ever took a writing class with the state. And I remember I was sitting in somewhere in this room, and the instructor was saying that the whole point of writing is to communicate, to let vendors know what you want them to know and what you want them to do, etc. It is not to impress them, unless you are writing, I guess, a novel or something like that. It's not to impress them that you have some kind of wonderful knowledge of the English language, so that you can see how creative you can be in how many different words you can use and how obtuse those words can be, because you're trying to impress that you know a lot of words. And the person said the epitome of business communication is relatively short sentences, relatively simple words, and putting them together in a simple fashion, so when it's done, almost nobody has any doubt what you've just told them. And that made sense to me. And I also remember that someone else in the class raised his hand and said, there are 50,000 words in the English language. And I think it is incumbent upon us to use those words in our communication, that instead of using so few words, we use words that are out there in the English language domain, so that people know there are more words. So whose viewpoint do you think was correct, the instructors or the person that thought that the more of the 50,000 you use, the better? The instructor, yes. So that's the point. Okay, let's see. So we have continued. The issue of avoiding redundancy, and so this is my little statement, the colon is your friend. Not very friendly for very long. Well, now we're back again. Thank you. Okay. We've replaced the operator.
Now you have power in your hand.
Power, yes. When there are a series of points, statements, bullets, etc., beginning with the same words, instead of repeating all the words all the time, only use the word once followed by a colon. Example, using a variation of the contents of slide 358. If you look back at 358, that was the trash removal situation where we talked about different ability to get variation in bids from vendors, what you had the right to do, etc. And so going back to 358, if you use those same points with a colon, here's how they would read. The agency reserves the right to, and saying those 6 words one time avoids having to say those same 6 words 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other times, or 4 other times. So the agency reserves the right to alter pickup days, request additional pickups, have extra containers provided, change the size of containers, cancel a normal pickup. And if you did not do it in this manner, you would have this. The agency reserves the right to alter pickup days. The agency reserves the right to request additional pickups. The agency reserves the right to have extra containers provided. The agency reserves the right to change the size of containers. The agency reserves the right to cancel a normal pickup. It gets tiresome just, well, certainly saying it. It also gets tiresome reading it because you just start glossing over because it's, okay, I already know that we reserve the right. What are you actually saying? That's what people, it's what happens when you have just what seems to go on endlessly. So saying the agency reserves the right to 5 times in a row is monotonous. After the 3rd or 4th time, people tend to gloss over the later points. So keeping things succinct both improves readability and understandability, which is what you're seeking. The focus is on the words that are different, not the ones that are the same. Accordingly, there should be a conscientious, this should be what you try to do. You should specifically try to, after you write something, then try to go back and refine it. Can I take a number of these words that I have as separate standalone statements, perhaps with the exact same or very similar introductory language, and put them all together with one introductory statement, and then just list them in the order with the colon, like per the example 1 or 2 slides before this. So if you conscientiously try to segregate requirements together, then it makes things easier. It makes it a little shorter. Depending on how many times you do this, might make this a lot shorter. And it makes it more understandable, which is the primary issue. Segregating together makes it easier for vendors to understand the requirements. The agency to create the contract compliance checklist, which is something when you're monitoring, when you're the contract manager, we're advocating to a degree in this class and much more in the Perform class that you create a contract management checklist, contract compliance checklist, which says what the vendor's to do. And the more succinct it is in your solicitation, the easier it is to put it into a document that's more or less a checklist for you to see what the vendor has to do, when they have to do it, to what standard they have to do it, and how much they're going to get paid for it. That's kind of like the checklist. So it makes it easier. Straightforward language. So again, the selected offer must agree that it will meet monthly with the agency's contract manager. So the words that are in orange, yellowish orange, agree that it will. Do they mean anything? The vendor will, the offer must agree that it will meet monthly. And what we are saying is, instead of saying that, just say the selected offer must meet monthly with the agency's contract manager.
Question.
Yes?
Notice your use of must instead of shall, which is a
Getting to that. Must, shall, one strong and one stronger.
must is not a directive. Shall.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you in a couple slides what we say and what our lawyers agree that we say. So in the example I just gave, agree that it will is deleted. These words add nothing. In fact, the meaning is clearer without them. Doing this throughout the solicitation saves words and improves readability, i.e. less is more. And the old, was it the Alka-Seltzer commercial? Try it, you'll like it. Don't just say what has to be done, say when it has to be done. That's another frequent deficiency in specifications, that people are focused on what a vendor has to do, and frequently they neglect to say when they have to do it. And sometimes I've gone back to agencies, and just to be a little bit funny, I say, okay, so it doesn't matter to you if they do it 6 months from now, a year from now, just as long as it's done before the contract's over, it's good. And they'll typically come back and say, no, I want it done within a month. And I'll say, okay, so you think you ought to say that then somewhere in the specifications? and it doesn't take very long before they say, yeah, I should say that, and now that I think about it, I haven't said that many other places, so I think I need to go back and do some more work. It's kind of like going through the robbery exercise. Once you have something pointed out to you, then you can start applying that in your specifications. So when, always ensure that it is clear who all parts of the specifications apply to. That's another issue, that you can say something, but there unfortunately are many times when it isn't clear whether you're saying it is a requirement for the offerer to do, whether it is a commitment that you, the agency, will do, or whether it's a commitment that some other entities, perhaps another contractor, will do this, so it will be something that will interface with or coordinate with the contractor. So it is clear what the words are saying, it just isn't clear who it pertains to. So you always have to keep asking yourself the what, when, who questions continuously. So whenever you write something, after you review it, you do this mental checklist. Is it clear what the vendor is supposed to do? Is it clear when they are supposed to do it? And is it clear what I've written, who it pertains to, the vendor versus the state? And one of the simplest ways to do that is to just keep those two parts separate. Have in your scope of work or your specifications everything the vendor is supposed to do, and then have another section that says state-supplied resources or state-supplied activities, whatever. So just by doing that, you segment, here's everything the vendor is supposed to do, here's what the state's going to do. Just simple little activities. Let's see. Use the words in the solicitation, not your memory. And this is something all of us do. I do it. That sometimes when you proofread something, or more often when you give it to somebody and ask them to read it, and ask them to say, now, tell me what I've said. And they say something different than what you thought you said. And the initial reaction is to start showing them where they were wrong. But what you shouldn't necessarily do is show them where they're wrong. You need to start and ask yourself, did I communicate clearly what was in my mind, what I intended to say? Or were the words on the paper not what I intended to say? So now that someone has pointed it out to me, I need to change my words. You know what you meant. Vendors only know what is written. If you can't tell what the words in the solicitation mean, vendors won't be able to tell either. If you read something and the first thing you say is, what did it say? You know you have to change it, because it shouldn't be there if it doesn't say anything. And you may intend to say something, but if you can't tell what is meant by what you said, you need to say it again. You need to change your words. Simple rules. Don't have undefined terms or abbreviations. And I see this many times, where there will be phrases, words, acronyms used that are not defined. And sometimes it is very crucial. We are having an agency redo a procurement because they did not define the crucial element of pricing. So it's unclear what the vendors were supposed to price to, how it will be able to be monitored, simply because they didn't define a couple key terms. So let's see. Don't include, this is another one that happens frequently. Don't include instructions, policies, etc. that are aimed at state personnel. And there have been many times, again, when I'm reviewing specifications and talking to agency personnel, I'll say, now, does this pertain to the vendor? Knowing all the while that it doesn't. And they'll say, no, but I know the people at the facilities, at the administration, or whomever, just don't follow the rules. So I wanted to put it here in the solicitation so that the state personnel will know what the rules are and the state personnel will follow the rules. And what's wrong with that thought process? The specifications are designed to communicate to the vendors and let vendors know what they are supposed to do. That is not the means to communicate to state personnel how they are supposed to do things internal to the agency. You communicate with your internal people not through a vendor's contract. You communicate through policies or regulations or letters or memos or whatever, but not through a contract with the vendor. Because again, the vendor is going to be, does this apply to me? The presumption is if it's in the specifications, it should apply to them. So again, you have an ambiguity. Does it apply? Does it not apply? And if I'm the vendor and not sure, I may think it applies to me. I may price accordingly, and I may price extra money in there to do something that really isn't focused on me at all. And it just creates confusion and possible ambiguity. And as we said, ambiguity is bad. Let's see. Only include information that vendors need, which is the same thought. If any part of the specification doesn't serve a positive purpose, delete it. I.e., if the words were not included, would anyone from the state miss them? Like the example from the 2 slides previously, which was agree that it will. You take them out, nothing is lost. In fact, it is better without it. And I have had lots of times, again, I keep saying all the things that I've done over the years and continue to do. Lots of times I will ask someone from an agency to explain to me what certain words mean. And I think I've mentioned this before. And I can't count how many times they've told me, I don't know, it was just in the specifications of the previous contract, so I just used it as the starting point. I just thought it had to be there. And so I say, do you need it? Well, no, I don't need it. I don't know what it means. So you don't have a problem deleting it? No, I don't have a problem. It's gone. If you can't think of what something means, it shouldn't be there. Because again, a vendor won't know what it means if you don't know what it means. Provide sufficient description and explanation. While it is good to be succinct and to the point, brevity can be taken too far. Is the old Goldilocks, not too much, not too little, just right. If information, instructions, requirements are too brief, vendors may not understand them and may not know enough to seek clarification. That's the worst part, when the vendors don't ask questions and thus don't get the information to make sure it's clear. Moreover, overly brief wording may favor an incumbent or a few vendors familiar with the past history of a contract, and that's an important point. If you say too little, the vendor, the contractor, the incumbent, or one who has worked on it before will know probably what they're supposed to be doing and will propose to that, price to that. Other vendors will not know, so in essence, they have been put at a disadvantage because you didn't correctly specify what you needed to. And they may not ask questions. That's always the problem if they don't seek clarification. The non-obvious missing information may be important. And I will say one little example that I will not mention the agency or any of the circumstances, but it was an evaluated procurement, and I was sitting at a meeting of the evaluation committee where they were at the point of recommending which vendors were technically qualified in preparation to, all right, let's decide which are qualified and do the ranking, and then we can open the financials. And well, actually, no, it was different. We'd already opened the financials, and it was a point where they were trying to decide which was the most advantageous offer with the combination of the technical aspects and the price. And we had a consultant who was assisting us for this particular procurement. And I was sitting there listening, and I was kind of doing a couple things at once. I was trying to read something and listen with one ear to what the person was saying. And this person said something that made me stop and perk up. And I said, would you repeat that? And the person repeated it. And then by this time, both my ears were standing straight up and focused on him. And I said, I don't understand what you just said. Would you repeat that again? And what the person was saying was, well, even though our incumbent vendor is more expensive than anybody else, I think that we should disregard that price difference and still take the incumbent because they understand what we really want them to do. And that's what I said about the third time. What do you mean what we really want them to do? And the person was a little hesitant to explain any further, but I said, no, come on, you need to tell me what you're getting at. And after a couple minutes of back and forth, what I was able to pull out of the person was, well, we actually included our specifications from the contract before the current contract, not the ones from the current contract. And so the vendor knew, or the incumbent knew enough to give us what's in the current contract because they knew that's what we wanted, and the other people only gave us what we put in our specifications. And we didn't have to restart, but most of you properly grimaced when you heard that, as I did. And I said, okay, at this point we will go no further because we need to do an amendment to our specifications to say what we mean. We're not having people try to be the what Johnny Carson used to be, where he used to discern what was in people's minds, etc. They're not supposed to be mind readers. In other words, if we told them something wrong, we can't make an award because one vendor knew better than to listen to what we wrote on the paper. And the answer was, we don't have time to issue an amendment and let vendors come in again. And I said, no, we don't have time not to. And so we, at that point, spent, I guess, about a day or so getting what we really wanted, then did an amendment to the specifications at that point, because we determined, no, that would not have caused vendors to bid or not bid. They just had to know what they were bidding to. And we issued that and gave vendors a week or so. So the whole process took probably about 10 days of delay, but we had to do it because you can't make an award when one vendor knows what you mean and the rest of the people don't because you didn't say it. I just still cringe at that little episode. Okay, let's see.
But that's the tool you use in the amendment.
If it's sealed proposals, if it's sealed bid, that's it. It's, well, first of all, you're not doing an evaluation. But if you have an error in a sealed bid procurement where you can't live with your own specifications, you got to reject and do it over. Either do it over completely, or depending on the circumstances, you may be able to go to a negotiated award after unsatisfactory competitive sealed bidding. You may be able to go to an emergency. Just depends on how urgent it is. But you can't go forward and award on a faulty premise. Okay, let's see. Fine Garcia. This is another thing that I learned. You've heard all this before, right? This is a standard procurement terminology, Fine Garcia, right? No? I think this was the very first training I ever received in the state. This is when I was in the state about a year. So this was around 1976. And I was working for the Department of Human Resources, and they about every month had a couple-hour training activity. So this one time, the training activity was Fine Garcia. And here's the little scenario that was explained. Supposedly during the Spanish-American War, I think 1898 is when that occurred, a young American officer was summoned to his commanding officer's tent. Upon arriving in the tent, the young officer saluted and was immediately handed an envelope by his superior. While handing the envelope, the commanding officer said, "Find Garcia and give him this." And with that, the young officer saluted, said, "Yes, sir," turned and left without another word. So, how many people, how many of you, if given those instructions, would know exactly what to do? Andrea knows, because Andrea knows everything. No one?
Who Garcia is.
Who is Garcia? Okay, what else would you want to know?
And where is he?
Where is he? Well, assuming it's a he even to begin with.
Oh, he's right.
Who is Garcia? Where do I find Garcia? Let me see, it probably has some other words here. As brief as this message was, in this instance it was sufficient, those words by themselves were sufficient to convey what was needed. However, if this message would have been presented to virtually anyone else, the reaction would have been a flurry of questions such as, who's Garcia? What's his full name? Do you have a picture of him? Where would I find him? Is he expecting me? Will he be trying to find me or avoid me? How do I get there? And on and on and on. Because for most people, you haven't the faintest idea. And the reason why this is in here is because you have to apply that to your specifications. The old thing, what I just said of you want to make sure they're not too much, not too little. You have to keep asking yourself, have I given enough information for vendors to know what I want them to do? Not redundancy, not confusing, but also enough so it is not the scenario that I just described where, okay, the incumbent knows what I want, but nobody else does. So when you're writing specifications, what I just said, is it sufficient for virtually any vendor to understand, or is it so brief that only a vendor with prior knowledge can understand or appreciate it, i.e., have you avoided the Find Garcia scenario? So now you will use that forevermore. When you write your specifications, you'll give it to your friend or your co-worker and say, tell me if I have a Find Garcia situation in here. And you all know what you mean. Right? Right. Okay, the Goldilocks solution, I've already said that. Try for just right, not too little, not a lot of redundancy and excess wording. You may not achieve perfection in your specifications wording, but a deliberate effort to avoid both too little and too much will help both vendors and you. You make the effort. And you give it to other people so they can help point out whether you have achieved the just right scenario. Will. Okay, now we're going to go through the words of wisdom according to DBM. Sometimes agencies use will as an equivalent or even stronger word for must or shall. What? I skipped a slide. In other words, use of must and shall. Okay. If I knew what I was teaching, I would have known I skipped a slide. For all practical purposes, must and shall mean the same thing. It is alleged that shall denotes a stronger sense of requirement than must. However, there is no legal support for this belief. Both must and shall convey requirements that a vendor has to satisfy. For the sake of variation, is to might also be used besides must or shall, i.e. the vendor is to meet monthly. So,
My English professor, please would
well,
disagree with that.
I
Shall's
specifically
directive.
went to my principal counsel years ago because I have heard this innumerable times from other agencies. I never heard it here in the health department. But I continue to hear it from agencies, so I went to my principal counsel a number of years ago and said, from a legal standpoint, is shall a stronger word than must? And my principal counsel said, does must mean you must do something? And I said, yes. Does shall mean you must do something? And I said, yes. Do I need to say anything more? And I said, yes. Tell me more. He said, no, they mean the same thing.
Legally, they do.
They both convey a requirement for a vendor to satisfy. So if in your mind one is stronger than another, that's fine, I guess. But from a legal standpoint, they both mean the same thing.
And that's the important thing. I thought there were two distinct. Must meaning that this is something that you can comply with, but you can take exception to. Shall is a directive.
Okay, what he said is he thought must was something that a vendor could take an exception to, whereas shall was something a vendor would not be permitted to take exception to. And again, from the standpoint of the lawyers that I have dealt with, both of them mean the vendor is supposed to do something, without one being stronger than the other. Yes?
I just wanted to comment that I have taken training from the Division of State Documents and Writing Regulations.
Okay.
They say they do carry different weight, so I guess it's for that purpose.
what she said is she took training from the Division of State Documents, and they made a differentiation between the words. All I can tell you is I went to my principal counsel, plus I've done this many times, both here in the health department with various assistant AGs, and none of them ever told me there was a difference in those words. They all said they mean the same thing from a legal perspective. So I've listened to them.
And if you're using it must or shall, you should use it throughout the whole document.
You mean consistently use one word? I don't know that you, if you want to use one word, fine. But from my standpoint, I have no trouble with saying must sometimes, shall sometimes, is to sometimes, because sometimes it gets monotonous. But if you want to use one word consistently, that's up to you. As long as that word...
When they do come up to DBM, it's all important who you got. No, you've used must. You must use this throughout. No, you shall. No, you must. So that's why I want the clarification.
Well, if there's anyone from DBM that is making an artificial distinction...
Over the years with different contracts, it's always whoever gets a hold of it at that time, you know?
Well, you only have one person that gets your specifications, and that's been the case for about 4 years now.
And I mean, when we do the team meeting, the teleconference, that's when we will have different suggestions and please change this or.
I will ask Mr. Howard whether he does make such a distinction.
I always do a search for must, and every one of them get changed to shall.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
That's up to you. If you want to make it shall consistently, that's up to you. All right, my compatriots here will remind me to buttonhole Michael tomorrow and say, Michael, what are you saying about must and shall? And he's probably going to say, okay, they mean the same thing. Hopefully he will say they mean the same thing to me. Yes? Joy's going to tell me something different.
Well, Sherry Lynn, one of the legal advisors we have, has emphasized shall. She prefers the word shall.
Prefers.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know that she makes it a must, but.
I asked Mr. Bruce P. Martin directly, and Mr. Bruce P. Martin, who is Sherry Lynn's boss, said they mean the same thing. Let's see. Use of will. So we have must, shall, and now will. Sometimes agencies use will as an equivalent. You will listen to me. You will comb your hair, wash your hands. And sometimes people think will is even stronger than must or shall. And again, while there is some support for this position, as a general rule, will should not be used in this context. Instead, will should be used to denote something the state or a party other than the contractor will do, something the vendor can rely upon to happen, occur, or be done, not something that is a requirement of the vendor. So the general words are, if you think shall is stronger than must, fine. But from a legal standpoint, both of them are equivalent. Will should not typically be used as a requirement for what a vendor should do. So that is something that I can understand if we came back and said, don't use will for identifying the requirements of the vendor. But hopefully we didn't say, make a distinction between must or shall. And if we did, we won't in the future. It is vitally, now we're moving to definitions and abbreviations. So I've already said a number of slides ago that you should not have undefined terms. So now I'm doing more on doing my spiel to convince you that definitions and abbreviations are your friend. It is vitally important to help prevent ambiguity by having a section of the contractor's solicitation that spells out what abbreviations and various terms mean, either with specific definitions or by identifying where the specific definition can be found. If you simply cite the source, i.e. the Webster New World Dictionary, Volume 5, 2010 edition, such and such is defined as, well, such and such is, that's where you go for the definition. So if you can cite the specific source for where the definition can be found, you do not have to repeat it Depends on how long the definition or explanation is as to whether you include it or make reference to where it can be found. Usually, this section should be toward the beginning of the document, often second or third clause or section of the first part. Because if it's up front, people will read the definitions, they will focus on them, then they can use them and know what they mean as they read further on in the document. So this is a general recommendation. Do not take the position that all the vendors in this business know what these terms mean. I have heard that innumerable times. Why do I have to define that? If they don't know what this means, I don't want them responding to this. I mean, they're in this business. Why should I have to tell them what their business is? And I listened to that for about the 10,890th time and say two things. Number one, humor me. Do it. But the other thing, then I start usually explaining of why it is important to do it. Because usually, even though vendors may know what these terms mean, you will find they frequently have amnesia. That when they are at the point of submitting proposals, bids, etc., yes, they know what it means. But when you are in contract management, and when you are expecting them to do something, and they don't do it, and you call them on it, and you say, well, you didn't do this particular requirement. And they say, well, I don't interpret that as meaning what you just said. Well, everybody in your answer is, well, sure you do. Everybody in the business knows this. And they may come back and tell me, well, where is there anything that says that? We didn't make that interpretation when we bid. So our bid did not include the interpretation you, the state, just said to me. And then you're going to think, gee, if I'd only defined that, despite the fact that everyone knew it, then I wouldn't be in this situation right now. So because of what might happen, it's much better, even if it's going to be repetitive, even if you think it is unnecessary, define your terms. Then everybody knows what they mean. Whether they say they meant something different, sometimes you'll find out that that isn't what the industry supposedly means. Or sometimes you'll find out some vendors interpret it that way and other vendors interpret it differently now that you have defined it. And you want to know that in advance so you have the continuity of bids, proposals, etc. on the same basis. Define it. They may only know this until it isn't convenient for them to know. If it's something where they think they can get away with doing less for the price that they bid, then that's where the amnesia comes in. Wait a minute, that isn't what I understood this to mean. And because you didn't define it, you are back into the situation of an ambiguity, and whether it's a patent ambiguity or a latent ambiguity. And if it's a patent ambiguity, well, if it's a latent ambiguity, as per the George Washington situation, they didn't ask a question of what we meant by a national certification entity because to them they clearly understood that they meant that, so they didn't have to ask a question. Because we didn't define it, we ended up doing what they wanted, which in that case was something good for us anyway, but it isn't usually going to be that scenario. It's going to be something where what's good for them isn't good for the state. Let's see. All right, patent and ambiguity. For instance, as described in ambiguity example 1 starting, well, I just said that. Okay, national certification. If we would have defined national certification, it would have saved much time and effort, and it would have saved even more time and effort if we would have denied the protest and gone through a protracted situation at the Board of Contract Appeals only to either be found right or wrong, but with a lot of effort expended to get to that point. All could have been saved by defining that term. By having the section up front, it makes it easier to read the document thereafter with proper understanding of what's required. We in section 1, we at DBM in section 1.2, that is our standard abbreviations and definitions section. So we give our introduction statement number 1. The very second thing in our solicitations are abbreviations and definitions. And I encourage my people to be relatively, have abundance of definitions and abbreviations interpretation. It's better to interpret it, even if ultimately it proves that you didn't need to, than to not interpret it and ultimately interpret that you did need to. And one exception to that is if there's a very large definitions and abbreviations section, it may be better to make this an attachment rather than have it as taking up 5-10 pages in the document itself. I've seen that occasionally, but usually it's better up front. And the times I have primarily seen it is when it's been that shopping list with 100 different definitions, only half of which apply to the actual procurement. It is not, what I've just said, it is not recommended to have a generic one-size-fits-all definitions and abbreviations section that includes terms that aren't used. If a generic definitions and abbreviations list is relied upon, an agency may fail to define something unique. If all you do is use your standard definition, you may not even pay attention to something that is pertinent to your particular procurement that isn't in your generic term definitions. So not having generic definitions makes you focus more on what you need to define. Or the other part about cause confusion as to which terms do apply and which don't makes it harder for vendors to understand, obscures information. You want the purpose of your specifications is clarity to inform vendors, not to confuse them. So it's in your interest to avoid confusion and ambiguity. Risk that some vendors won't be able to tell whether some terms apply. I've kind of said this. They could include abiding by the non-applicable terms in their price, could cause them to lose or cost the state more. Some vendors won't even respond if they can't tell. The old issue of risk. Well, if you can't tell what you're supposed to do, should you even bother responding? And it costs the state if vendors don't respond. Or they may take exception, file protest on something that really isn't applicable to a procurement. Another example is simplifying the solicitation by excluding unnecessary words. If the words don't add anything, delete them. Don't define things that don't pertain. Salient characteristics. And these are used for when you do typically sealed bid procurements for brand name or equal. This is where this comes into play. Typically when you're buying equipment. And you specify, we would like to buy a Sony model XYZ 2000 or equivalent. Okay, so if you're Panasonic or if you're Samsung, do you have something that's like a Sony, what I say, a ABC 2000 or XYZ, whatever I just said? Is your model the equivalent of that model? And the way you find out is, and the way it is specified in COMAR is, you can say that, but you cannot say only that. You must then identify specifically the characteristics of that equipment which you will deem to make something equivalent. I.e., this is what it has to look like, this is what it has to perform like, this is what it has to do, etc. Either dimensions or output or input or whatever, you will give the criteria for determining what is equivalent. And if you don't do that, anything that you do not say specifically is a necessary characteristic, you cannot later say is a reason you didn't select a vendor, i.e. you found them non-responsive because you determined they were not equivalent. And the reason they were not equivalent was because of a characteristic that you didn't say had to be there. You're going to lose. If you go back to them and say for something that wasn't in there and could not be reasonably inferred or interpreted from what you said, and they challenge it, they will win, because the requirement of COMAR is you must state the salient characteristics of what you're specifying that will determine what equivalence is. And
I've used approved equivalent in the past, meaning that we have to prove it, but we haven't identified the specific items.
again, the issue is when you say approved equal, meaning that you don't specify what will be equal, but that they have to provide it to you and you'll make the determination. Again, if you come up with something that they would have not, if you reject them for something they never thought would be something that you were looking at, and they file a protest, it's very possible they will win. And even if you don't want to get to a protest stage, protests cause problems. They're time consuming. The best thing is tell them what you want. They might save the energy both for them and for you if they know that's what you want. Or if you tell them what you want, they may be able to come to you and say, well, that's obsolete, or here's why mine does a better job of what you really want this to do than even that piece of equipment. You just don't know what my new offering, my new piece of equipment can do. So you're specifying old requirements. But I don't know if you don't tell me. Carry on?
Yeah.
I'll carry on.
Yeah.
You know me.
Yeah.
Carry on. All right, let's see what else I've said here. Term used when running specification for a solicitation to buy a brand name, tangible item, equipment, etc., or equivalent, and the award will be made solely on price. So this is, again, a requirement of competitive sealed bidding. It means the objective features of the desired product, which will be the sole comparison points used to determine if an offered product is equal to the desired product. You cannot use salient characteristics solely to give one vendor an advantage over another vendor. And I think I gave the example several days ago of you cannot specify you want a table that is 29 3/8 inch high, because the vendor that you really want to award to is the only one that makes a table 29 3/8 inch high, and everyone else makes it 29.5 inches high. So you can say, oh, nope, everyone else is non-responsive because their table is off by 1/8 of an inch, if you had no good reason to have required that specific finite specification. So you must tell them. And if you say 29 3/8 inch, a vendor can challenge your specifications. Why do you have to have 29 3/8? And if you can't give a good reason, they should win. That means you should uphold their protest. And if you don't, and they appeal it to the Board of Contract Appeals, they're going to win at the Board of Contract Appeals if you cannot give a good reason for having made that specification. But the other example I gave from that same several days ago was if you have a finite space and it has an extremely narrow tolerance that it must be to 1/8 of an inch or it isn't going to fit, then you can specify those exact dimensions even if it gets to the point of making it a sole source. If you can demonstrate that you can't do anything other than make it fit in that one location. So you must say what your requirements are. It isn't sufficient to just say that competing products have to be similar, equal to a stated brand name reference product, the standard of comparison, the characteristics that will be accepted as being similar or equal must be identified, and it is improper to pick some obscure feature that only desired product has and say this feature is needed. Specifications cannot be unreasonably restrictive. That is in regulation, and the other thing that is in regulation is that control agencies, DGS, DBM, do it, are required to review your specifications to make our own determination as to whether your specifications are unreasonably restrictive. And if we determine they are unreasonably restrictive, we are required to make you change your specification. And if you don't change your specification voluntarily, we'll change them for you. Because our requirement is that we make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Should not be unreasonably restrictive. And you say, yep, I'm never unreasonably restrictive. I'm a reasonable person. Anything I say, I need. I don't say things I don't need, so I'm not unreasonably restrictive. Well, sometimes that is true and sometimes it's not. I'm trying to be funny. I realize I didn't go over very well. Every now and then I have to tell you when I'm making a joke. That's why I'm doing this and not stand-up comedy. Although some people at times think I am doing stand-up comedy. Let's see. Here we are, 21040103. Salient characteristics should, to the degree possible, state functional or performance features while limiting design or other detailed physical descriptions to those necessary to meet the needs of the state. So you say what you need from a performance standpoint. Exercise. Well, we're not going to do this exercise now. What I'm going to do is ask for 2 volunteers. And I'm going to ask those 2 volunteers to stay with me for around 2 minutes before, while the rest go to break. So I want 2 people who are going to volunteer to participate in the what is similar exercise. 2 people. And everyone's sitting on their hands saying, not me. I'm not going to go through that robbery exercise. 1, we have 1 and 2. Okay, if you 2 would stay here. Brave people. I only take about 2 minutes, then the rest of you can go break, come back in 15 minutes, and I'll tell you 2 what I want you to do.